Hi, and welcome to Power Play. I'm Michael Couture. Bashi Kapelos is on assignment tonight. Today, we look at the cabinet countdown. In less than 24 hours, we'll know who Mark Carney has tapped to be in his inner circle, or circles. CTV has some of those details, and we'll have them for you in just moments. Then, our front bench will break down the challenges and calculations the Prime Minister faces as he builds his core team. Plus, a trade truce between the U.S. and China.
The relationship is very good. We're not looking to hurt China.
Markets surged today as the U.S. and China paused tariffs for 90 days. What could this mean for Canada? We're going to talk to our ambassador in Washington, Kirsten Hillman. Then, Alberta freezes its industrial carbon tax.
This, I hope, will prompt a conversation for us to get in sync with the federal government. That's what we've been asking to do.
Premier Danielle Smith backing off a deal with the feds to meet their industrial carbon price by the end of this decade. The province argues the federal rate could devastate their industry. A little later, we'll talk to Alberta's Environment Minister, Rebecca Schultz. First, though, we begin tonight with some details and some breaking news from the Prime Minister's office on what Mark Carney's cabinet will look like tomorrow. Here are the details, here with the details, I should say, our CTV national news correspondent, Rachel Aiello. Rachel, thanks for joining us. What are you learning tonight about the makeup of this cabinet?
Yeah, so what we have confirmed from the Prime Minister's office so far is that Carney's cabinet roster is going to be under 30 people. But the way they're working around this, Mike, is essentially installing a two-tiered team. So there's going to be the first core tranche of ministers that are going to take the lead on the big files: finance, defense, trade, Trump likely. And then there will be this secondary roster of up to 10 ministers of state. So these are going to be individuals who will play kind of lessened cabinet roles. I'm being told they won't necessarily be on all the cabinet committees, won't be at every cabinet meeting, but could be tapped in for certain decisions. It's also possible that this roster of ministers of state, secretaries of state, I should say, would essentially be helping out ministers who've got big files. So you talk about defense as an example, you know, the NATO commitment, Arctic, it's possible we could see a secretary kind of come in and play an assistance role there. So that's what we know so far. The other big detail that we are hearing is expect to see more than 50% of the new faces walking up to Rideau tomorrow will actually be rookies, new faces, people who weren't already in cabinet.
What are you hearing from the Prime Minister's office on trying to maintain that gender parity and the regional representation? Because that is something that they do have the ability to do now, having MPs in every province.
Yeah, so it remains to be seen, Mike, if Carney's commitment of upholding gender parity will be modeled both in the core cabinet and with the ministers of state, or if he's going to use the ministers of state, these secretaries of state coming in to help kind of flesh out that balance. Remains to be seen, but you make a great point. In the election, the Liberals were able to elect a number of people from across the country. So Carney's going to have an easier time making up that regional representation. So I do expect he will lean into what he has available and ensure that there are cabinet ministers or these secretaries of state representing across the country. Key balance there is going to have to be making sure that you're not just putting one region all into the junior minister section.
Yeah, and same thing with male-female, making sure that you don't have junior ministers or these sort of ministers of state being overloaded as females as well. CTV's Rachel Aiello, thanks so much for all those details. She'll be back with us. If there are any more details that we learn in the next hour, also watch for her reporting on CTV National News later tonight. Well, that cabinet is being made with the trade war as a backdrop. Canada continues to fight tariffs from the United States, and today there is a glimmer of hope for our country. That's because Beijing and Washington have reached an agreement to pause most of their tariffs on each other for at least 90 days.
The talks in Geneva were very friendly. The relationship is very good. We're not looking to hurt China. China was being hurt very badly. They were closing up factories. They were having a lot of unrest. And they were very happy to be able to do something with us. And the relationship is very, very good. I'll speak to President Xi maybe at the end of the week.
So the impact on the markets was immediate today. The S&P 500 jumped 3.3%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average was up more than 1,100 points after the deal on most of the tariffs between the two countries was announced. The U.S. has agreed to reduce its 145% tariffs to 30%, and China is dropping its 125% tariffs down to 10%. Here in Canada, the S&P TSX Composite Index was up by 174 points. Now, the changes will take effect on March the 14th. China exports to the United States fell sharply last month, hitting the country's critical manufacturing sector and that industry as well. And America's gross domestic product contracted for the first time since early 2022. What could that signal for Canada? Kirsten Hillman is Canada's ambassador to the United States, and she joins me right now. Ambassador Hillman, welcome back to Power Play. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Given the news that we saw on tariffs with China and the United States today, how should Canadian citizens feel about our trade talks that are going on with the United States right now?
Well, I think it's interesting. So there was a China-U.S. deal that came out today and the UK-U.S. last week. From my perspective, these are useful arrangements to have come into the public domain now, because it gives us a sense of where the U.S., might be willing to go on some of the issues that are more sensitive to it, like sectoral tariffs and other regulatory issues. So I think it's useful to see. Obviously, the arrangement with China is quite dramatic. It's just a pause, but they really have lowered those tariffs down to about 30%. So that's a big change. Probably there's a lot of supply chains around the world that are breathing a bit of a sigh of relief, because the trade between China and the United States doesn't just affect China and the United States. There's, it's a pretty integrated world out there. So it's probably a good thing for Canadian businesses that are kind of wrapped up in those supply chains.
When we look at those two deals, and I take your point that with China, it's essentially a pause until they have an actual landing place. But do you think that Canadians need to get ready and brace themselves for some sort of baseline tariff with the United States? Is that something that business just needs to get used to right now?
I wouldn't say that. I think there's a lot that remains to be seen in where we're going to get to with the United States, obviously. I think it's important for us to recognize that Canada's relationship with the United States is unique to us. It's not the same as China. It's not the same as UK. It's not the same as the EU. It's not the same as Mexico, even though, we've been integrated under the CUSMA for many years, the NAFTA and then the CUSMA. So we're their biggest customer. We have a 9,000-kilometer border. We have deeply integrated industries. They're quite dependent on Canada for a number of commodities that they just don't have at home. There's just a very unique profile that we have. And so the outcome that's going to make sense for Canada, the one that's going to be good for us, I think will be bespoke to our relationship.
So when you say that we have very unique circumstances with the United States, do you think that they understand that? And in your discussions with United States Trade Advisor, USTR, Jameson Greer, what are those talks like? Are you more confident now this week than maybe you were last week going into that meeting between Prime Minister Carney and President Trump?
I think there's kind of two aspects to how this plays out. There's the technical people who have been doing this for a while, including USTR Greer. He was in the first Trump administration. He worked with USTR Lighthizer when we renegotiated the NAFTA into the CUSMA. He is very familiar with the Canada-U.S. trading relationship. He's very familiar with the details of that, and he's supported by an agency also that has been working with us for years. And then there is, there is in any government, but probably even more so in this one, a very strong direction from the very top. And the president himself has very clear ideas about trade and sort of reorienting the U.S. profile with respect to trade. So I think that the answer to your question is we have a good relationship with those who have been working with us on trade for many, many years. But they are under specific direction from their leader, which is different than they've been under in the past, including even in the past Trump administration. So it's a bit of a two-part discussion, if you will. And that's why the meeting between Prime Minister Carney and President Trump was so useful, not only did it set a good tone, not only did it have those two leaders start to get to know each other, but it was clear coming out of that, and even in the public, portions that you were part of, that the president is eager to have a positive professional relationship with Canada. There's a lot of work yet to do. There'll be ups and downs, no doubt, but the tone from the top, I think, has been set in a really positive way.
Because of that tone from the top, are you expecting your next meetings with the trade representative to be a bit easier going forward? Do you think that there is this sort of new common ground that you can land on?
I think it will absolutely help. I mean, we all are responsible to deliver for those that are leading our countries. I think it will help, but I don't think, we are very, we are neighbors who know each other well and have a strong desire to do good stuff together, but at the same time have our own domestic imperatives that aren't always easily reconcilable. We will find a path. I'm quite confident that we will, because it's in the interest of our citizens for us to do so, and therefore we will find a path. But it doesn't mean, as I say, sometimes these discussions can be tough. They can be tense. They can take a little bit of time. You have to find the right route to get where you want to go. But that's okay. Canada is up for it. I have every confidence in us and all of the professionals who work in this area and our political leadership that we're gonna do a good deal for Canadians. It may not look like what it's looked like before. It won't look like anyone else's, but we won't stop till we have the right deal.
How do these two things happen at the same time? And I say that because we have COSMA that is there, and that even in the Oval Office, the president had said, look, it's working and it's sitting there and it's doing okay. But at the same time, there are these separate negotiations that are happening with the tariffs. Which do you think is possibly going to get done quicker? And I say that because I think a lot of people are looking at the tariffs and saying that has to get done before we even talk about reopening that new NAFTA.
Right. Well, I think that the Prime Minister and the President gave us a direction, which was to sit down and get going on our bilateral issues. That was a pretty clear direction. So I think that will certainly start first. And the U.S. is having these bilateral discussions with a whole host of countries, including Mexico, by the way. Mexico's in town here in Washington regularly, almost every week, I think. So those discussions are happening. There are things that we will deal with the Americans on that are more bilateral than trilateral. And as I say, the leaders have put a priority on that. The USMCA, CUSMA, as we call it, it comes up for review in 2026. I think the president said there it is. It's coming up for review. Many speculate, could that review be moved up a bit in time? I suppose that's possible. But right now, the priority is to deal, for Canada, obviously, it's to deal with the tariffs that have been imposed, I think, unjustifiably on our country, get those dealt with, and then move on to trying to put ourselves in a position of stability in our relations with the United States.
Reuters is reporting today that the Mexican economy minister is expecting that review of CUSMA to start early in the second half of this year. Is that what you're hearing on the ground in Washington?
I think there are people who are certainly making that pitch. Whether it will come to pass or not is yet to be seen. All I can say is, again, the direction from the top is to get going on the bilateral discussions. And what happens with the CUSMA is something that we'll deal with in due course. But there are varying views on whether we should be waiting to 2026 or we should be getting going on that right away. As I say, for us, fundamentally, our goal is to deal with the tariffs that are in place that are causing harm to the Canadian economy, to Canadian workers, to American workers as well, obviously, and find a place of stability, and then see where we go next.
So when you're saying that some people are making that pitch for that early renegotiation, is that Canada that is part of that pitch to say that we should get this done sooner?
No, I think that we are again focused on the result, and the result that we need is to get those tariffs off. And the president has put forward the proposition that we will do that in a bilateral discussion. That we need to be focusing on what the forum is to get to where we need to go for Canadians. And the president's made that quite clear. So that's where we're going to, we're going to take that up. And then what happens with the CUSMA will be, again, addressed in due course.
I wanted to ask you this question based on your experience in D.C. You've been in the room when U.S. President Donald Trump met with former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for those meetings, and you were there for the meetings last week. How are the discussions different with that Prime Minister and now our current Prime Minister when you talk about that interaction with Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, there's been, over the years, I've been here as ambassador for 5 years, so I've seen a variety of different interactions between our former Prime Minister Trudeau, and President Trump, and each one, had its own characteristics. Some were tougher. Sometimes in the negotiations, those were harder meetings because we were really trying to grapple with important things, and the Prime Minister had to be strong in that regard, and that can lead to more tensions in the room. And many, for example, when we were dealing with COVID and we were trying to really cooperate together on COVID, those were incredibly positive and collaborative discussions. So there's a wide range. They were leading together for a number of years. So every discussion had its own context and tone and tenor. I think the meeting with Prime Minister Carney, as people would have seen, and then when we went into the private session, this was absolutely continued, was very respectful, very professional. What I've sort of been left with as an impression is, in particular, that the president was, it was important to him that this meeting demonstrate a positive inclination towards moving forward with Canada in a way that's good for both countries. That was clear, that was his objective. And all of the people that were there supporting him were also supporting that objective. And that is really important for us. I don't think it means that everything, again, not every meeting necessarily between leaders is always going to be without tough discussions, because these are really, really important issues. But it was a really great start. We've got a lot of path ahead of us. There'll probably be ups and downs, but boy, it was important. As I said earlier, this kind of work, there's the work that happens around the table, and then there's the tone that is set from the top, and the tone has been set in a way that is going to be very constructive for both sides.
Okay, unfortunately, we got to leave it there, Canadian Ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman. Thanks so much for joining us, as always.
Thanks for having me.
Now, managing Canada's relationship with the U.S. was the key issue for Mark Carney's election campaign, and it's likely a major factor in how the Prime Minister made his cabinet. A little later on in the show, we'll look at the challenges his front bench will face with our front bench. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone are all here today, and we'll bring them in just a little later on. First, though, the Liberals officially picked up another seat in the House of Commons over the weekend. A judicial recount has flipped the riding of Terrebonne from the Bloc Québécois to the Liberals. The margin was just one vote. This now gives the Liberals 170 seats in the House. That's just 2 seats shy of majority. And there are 3 more judicial recounts that have yet to be completed. On the other side of a quick break, Alberta is freezing its industrial carbon tax. Why are they doing it, and what's the impact? Alberta's Environment Minister Rebecca Schultz joins us next here on Power Play.
This, I hope, will prompt a conversation for us to get in sync with the federal government. That's what we've been asking to do ever since I talked to Mark Carney's predecessor, and I mentioned this in our first conversation. And it may be, as you go forward, that there's a tolerance to increase it, but I can tell you, I think that the business community has reached its limit. And why does it matter? We're competing for capital with the United States. Those dollars can flow anywhere. And if we get too far ahead of where the Americans are, then all of those billions of dollars of investment will not come here.
A clear message today from Alberta Premier Danielle Smith on industrial carbon pricing. Now, back in 2022, her province agreed to meet the federal industrial carbon pricing schedule, which would have seen the price hit $170 per ton by the year 2030. But today, Smith and her government announced an indefinite freeze at the current rate of $95 a ton. We reached out to the federal government for a response, but have not heard back just yet. So why is Alberta backing off that agreement? Well, Rebecca Schultz is Alberta's Environment Minister, and she joins us right now. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So as I just mentioned, 3 years ago, your government had that deal to meet the federal equivalency requirements for industrial emitters. Why are you deciding to walk away from that agreement today?
Well, here's what I'll say. We're very much in a different time than we were a few years ago. At that time, the Liberal government, propped up by the NDP, had a mandate for, I would say, a pretty activist environmental agenda. We also were not facing the threats that we see right now from south of our borders with our major trading partners. And so, if we want to keep our industry competitive, and that's what the new Prime Minister ran on in this last election campaign, is supporting the Canadian economy and protecting us from risks of threats with tariffs, keeping us competitive and expanding our trade and export partnerships, then they will see that a carbon tax increasing to 170 will absolutely decimate our industry. It's not something that can continue, and that's why we've came out today and said that we're going to indefinitely freeze that price.
You had said what Mark Carney had campaigned on as, and now that he is prime minister, he also talked about making sure that there was a strong industrial side to the carbon tax. He's not moving away from that. So why do you think this fits in line with where he's going and what he campaigned on? Because you're moving back from that.
We're actually holding our industrial carbon levy at $95 a ton. What we're saying is that at a time like now, where there's so much uncertainty facing our major industries and so many other nations looking to us for our safe, affordable, reliable, responsibly produced energy, that we cannot put these additional punitive taxes on our industry at a time like this if we want to continue to lead the way, to support a strong Canadian economy, to build partnerships when it comes to energy, and also to do the right thing for the environment. We are 1.5% of global emissions. And it was just a couple of years ago that we were paying 34% of the industrial carbon tax. Canadians, and certainly we've heard this over the last couple of years, are asking why at the cost of affordability, energy security, which is an issue of national security. Certainly we've heard talked about over the last number of months, and really the benefits that our energy industry provides to the Canadian economy overall. We can't risk all that at a time like this.
So you talked about the instability, but back in 2022, then Minister Sonia Savage said maintaining this system made sense because the businesses had already booked the higher costs on their balance sheets. So what do you think has changed if back then your same government had said that it made sense to maintain this type of pricing schedule?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it was a different time. I think what you saw the Liberal and NDP government doing just a couple of years ago is markedly different than what they were campaigning on right now. I don't think Canadians at a time like this are willing to risk our energy security, our overall Canadian economy, jobs, and energy affordability for everyday Canadians across the country. I don't think that that's what Canadians want to see right now. And I think that's why you saw such a marked difference in the Liberal campaign and such a focus on national unity, energy security, and a strong Canadian economy. What industry is saying is that with all of the uncertainty, this is just one additional piece that makes us completely uncompetitive, especially when compared to our neighbors south of the border.
At the same time, you are maintaining this industrial cost. So I wanted to ask you specifically on that. The Canadian Climate Institute found that industrial carbon pricing systems will be responsible for between 20 and 48% of Canada's emissions reductions by 2030. Given how significant that is, how will you make up that type of reduction in emissions in Alberta specifically?
It's not surprising to me that you can find activist NGOs that support the path of the former minister, Stephen Guilbeault, when it came to environment. However, times have changed, and Canadians absolutely value energy affordability, jobs, a strong Canadian economy, and the ability to defend our economy against threats that we're seeing south of the border. We have been out there talking with industry over the last number of months as our tier review and our tier system has equivalency with the federal system right now. We've been talking to industry about what changes need to be made, and one message was loud and clear. $170 carbon tax will absolutely decimate our industries. We remain competitive now, although we are I would say industry is happy with the work that Alberta has done. They want to see Alberta continue to operate in the space and not have the federal government who quite frankly doesn't or hasn't seemed to understand energy development and production to oversee that type of programming. And so, that was what went into our decision today, is that we are seeing emissions reduction, we are seeing emissions intensity go down while our energy production goes up. That is why places like Japan, I was just there in February, they said, look, we know Alberta and British Columbia have the natural gas we need as an energy consumer. We see your energy as part of our very ambitious emissions reduction goals. What we can't understand is Canada. Where is Canada? Why would they be proposing production cuts and increased taxes on an industry that has the ability to do so much, not only for Japan, but Southeast Asia? And so certainly I know that's a message our premier has heard. I know other premiers have heard that. And that's, what we had as a major topic of conversation during this last federal election campaign.
But Minister, as part of your system in Alberta, there is a credit system in this that a number of industries pay into. There have been studies that show that removing or weakening this large emitter trading system that you have will devalue the $5 billion worth of credits that companies are holding right now. What do you tell those companies who are going to see those credits lose value now?
The value of credits has fluctuated over the last number of years for a variety of different factors. But the fact of the matter is that carbon credit market remains. Again, though,
it remains, but as a result of your government's action, it will be devalued. So if you are concerned about investments by industry, what are you going to tell those industries that have that $5 billion worth of credits now? They're going to see them devalued. If you are saying the goal of this is to make sure you're taking care of industry and maintain their competitiveness, that's $5 billion worth of credits that is not going to be worth that money anymore.
Again, here's what we would say. We've seen a fluctuation in the carbon credit market for a variety of reasons over the last number of years. Companies had options in terms of how to meet their obligations under our tier system, and that would be to either use credits or to pay their obligations. As we've seen that carbon price increasing to 170, of course, more companies would be looking to use carbon credits as opposed to paying out their obligations. But ultimately, in our discussions with industry, it was unequivocally clear that a $170 carbon price would absolutely decimate our major industries, our economy, and of course then impact our ability to provide safe, affordable, reliable, environmentally responsible produced energy to Alberta, to Canada, and to the rest of the world. That's not something that we're interested in right now, and I don't think that's something Canadians want to see.
Minister, just one last question, because I want to make sure that I understand it. You say that there are fluctuations in those credits. This is one that is being caused by you. This is not an external factor. Do you take responsibility for devaluing those carbon credits, that $5 billion worth?
Here's what I would say. We've been talking to industry over the last number of months, gathering their feedback on tier, because we recognize that there is so much uncertainty with federal policy and policy south of the border, creating stress and investment uncertainty on our major industries. We didn't want to have that. So we've been very transparent and open with industry, gathering their feedback unequivocally. I would say we heard that $170 carbon price would absolutely decimate industry. It is not something that we can continue to work towards. Holding it right now keeps us in line with the federal backstop. But you know what? Even the Canada Growth Fund, in striking agreements with Alberta companies, landed on a carbon price of $86.50. And so I think even folks within the federal government knew that 170 would be a very, very bad idea. This keeps us in that ballpark, keeps us aligned with the federal pricing system, at least in the near term, so that we can have this conversation with the federal government and see if they meant what they said about putting the Canadian economy first.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Alberta's Environment Minister, Rebecca Schultz, thanks so much for being with us here on Power Play.
My pleasure.
Time to take a quick break. Then we'll be right back with our front bench on Mark Carney's soon-to-be cabinet. Stick with us. Power Play will be right back. Welcome back. We've got some of the first details from the Prime Minister's office on what Mark Carney's cabinet will look like tomorrow. So first of all, it will have fewer than 30 ministers, but he'll bring back ministers or secretaries of state. That will be up to 10 members of that group. It is a second sort of outer ring of the team, if you want to call it, for smaller portfolios or to work on portfolios that really are breaking off the bigger portfolios. So between that, more than half of the members will be new faces walking up the driveway tomorrow or into Rideau Hall, however they decide to get there. So what does this tell us? Well, let's bring in our front bench. Former senior advisor to Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, Dan Moulton. He's now partner with Crestview Strategy. Shakir Chambers is vice president at Oyster Group. He worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. Kathleen Monk is the former director of communications for the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk and Associates. And Laura Stone is Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Welcome to Monday, all, and everybody's favorite day, the day before Cabinet, where we can talk about names and portfolios, and it's a bit of a dart game. So, Dan, I'm going to start with you on this one. Let's first talk about the composition and how we almost have these two rings of Cabinet, this inner core and then the outer ring. What do you think about going back to this sort of era? And I remember it under Stephen Harper, where we did have these ministers of state or secretaries of state. What do you think of how he's doing that?
Well, I think it's in an effort to send a message that they're getting down to work, that they've got focus, that they want to move quickly and get things done. Certainly, it does send a message that there are some portfolios that require senior leadership, people who have had extensive experience outside of government to be brought in to help provide, I think, fresh and new leadership for those big portfolios. It is, I think, a strategy that helps to continue that message of sharpening the focus that was in the pre-election cabinet that Carney rolled out just before calling the election. That is definitely an effort that this Prime Minister's office and this new Prime Minister have been undertaking, is to say, look, we're getting down to business. We're focused on a couple key, sort of key priorities. And I will say, I think these secretaries of state, or ministers of state, I should say, help to take that another step further, to say there are a couple policy files that we think deserve a little bit more dedicated attention. We're going to give them to these specific individuals to help move those forward, because we think that very discrete policy area is required. I recall, Charles Sousa did this, Kathleen Wynne did this in the first mandate she had. She made Mitzi Hunter the associate minister for an Ontario pension plan at the time. And it was really an effort to say, this one thing that we ran on is so important, we need to have a policy file just dedicated and a minister just dedicated to that. So, I can see them sending a lot of messages like that tomorrow. The thing that I'll be looking for, though, is there change to the structure of some of these super ministries? Minister of Industry for the last number of years has had like 5 or 6 ministers in it, a whole bunch of different moving parts to it. Does the Prime Minister look to take a portfolio like industry or like Natural Resources Canada and undertake some substantial change to how that department is presently structured, how we've come to see it structured over the last number of years, in order to move things forward? And certainly major infrastructure projects, major pipelines east to west, major Canadian nation-building infrastructure was a huge theme of Mark Carney during the campaign. So I could certainly see him looking at undertaking some change to how we structure some of the really big ministers and ministerial departments.
Shakir, that's one way of looking at it. The other way, I think, is that I remember during the Harper years, likely when you were in that Prime Minister's office, some people looked at them almost as junior ministers. How does the Carney government make sure that that's not how people see these ministers of state or secretaries of state?
So I think overall they will be junior ministers, but I think to Dan's point, they'll probably be specific on certain portfolios that are a priority to the Carney government. I think what's a bigger priority is honestly just getting things done. The composition and who he chooses in these key ministries will be very important, because I think some ministers are more skilled at, getting deputy ministers, at getting the bureaucracy to implement certain policies. And from everything I've heard from Mark Carney so far, he wants to move very fast, wants to be efficient, and just kind of get things done. So who are those key senior ministries that are driving things forward will be very important. I think the second big thing, and you had it up on your chart earlier, is just those 50% new faces in cabinet. who are these people? I think Mark Carney did a good job in the election, trying to implement or make the case that he was changed from Trudeau. And so you can't have these Trudeau-era cabinet ministers just rotating around in different portfolios. So who does he actually bring in that he trusts, that is competent to kind of get results that he wants? And I think the third thing that I would look for as well is someone like a Minister Freeland. Here's somebody who was a very senior minister in the previous government. Obviously very close to Mark Carney as well, but she's held some of the highest positions you can hold in this government without being prime minister. It's hard to see her in a role moving forward that's a very senior role. She can't touch the Canada-U.S. file because Trump obviously doesn't like dealing with her. She won't be deputy prime minister because she was too close to Justin Trudeau. And so I wonder what happens to her if she actually gets a portfolio. And to be quite frank, if she even hangs around in this government, given that for me, in my view, it's only downhill for her in terms of her responsibilities and seniority in this government.
Yeah, and Kathleen, I mean, you have to be careful with how you balance that. Also, at the same time, gender balance and regional balance as well. And all of these factors that you have to consider, especially what Shakir just said, 50-50 or half of them are going to be new. You got to make sure that there are people that can hit the ground running.
Yeah, and another controversy that happened in 2015 is that if you recall, when Justin Trudeau brought in his new ministry when he was first elected, he even though he said they were all ministers, there was some indication in the order and councils that in fact they were junior ministers. Right. So he elevated them up, raised their pay grade, and said no, everyone is all the same. They're all ministers. And so I think when you see these numbers, like I'm hearing 28 and plus the 10 ministers of state, that's basically the size of a Trudeau cabinet. But if he, because his high water mark, I think, was 39 around the cabinet table. But just to build on what Shakir and Dan have said, I think the reason why he's having a smaller cabinet table, smaller number of ministers, is he wants to make decisions quickly. So having 40 people around the table, it's just too much. So this way, those ministers of state, those junior ministers, don't sit at that large decision-making table. They only come to that table when their file's being discussed. So that way he can move quickly, move more seamlessly. But other things I'm really looking for beyond how he changes departments is how he changes cabinet committees and actually how the structure of government works. Will there be a DM shuffle that comes with this? Because that's really how the actual machine of government starts to work, and that's really important to think about.
Yeah, and whether or not they were people that were loyal to Trudeau or not, those deputy ministers are key.
And if they get stuff done and does stuff done quickly. Right?
Well, and that is what he wants. That is what he's saying he's doing. Laura, what are you looking for tomorrow when you see everybody walking into Rideau Hall and being sworn in?
Well, first of all, as a reporter covering Queen's Park, I want to know which minister is responsible for building the tunnel under the 401. I don't know if that's a full portfolio, maybe it's a junior minister.
If they walk in with a shovel.
Shovel it
the one that walks in with a shovel, Laura.
Look, I mean, I think Kathleen is right in the sense that this is being portrayed as more of a focused cabinet, but then if we're broadening it out but other people get to be ministers, but only when, and it's a time of importance, there's so many more kind of considerations beyond just who is in cabinet, what those cabinet roles are. There's regional representation, there's gender parity, there's, making sure that maybe bringing certain people back into the fold under a Carney government, that promises are kept. What happens to leadership contenders, to Shakir's point? I want to know who's in those key portfolios that are of utmost importance to Prime Minister Carney's first few months. Obviously dealing with the Trump administration, dealing with infrastructure, dealing with building pipelines and major infrastructure projects. Those are going to be key. We saw 3 of those faces, Ministers Jolie, LeBlanc, and McGuinty, brought into the meeting with President Trump. So surely they are either retaining their roles or are going to remain part of that inner circle. But what happens to some of the other bigger names? So really, it's those key roles in putting out the fires, frankly, that Mr. Carney needs to deal with right now, and then sort of what is the creative thinking around these new secretaries of state or ministers of state, and where is their focus lie? So obviously there's going to be a lot of new faces. It's they're trying to make certainly a break from the past and a break from the Trudeau government. So I think they're going to try to tell a very focused story yesterday on what exactly Prime Minister Carney is going to focus on within his first 6 months in government.
Yeah, and if they were in the Oval Office, does that mean they will necessarily be in cabinet? That is something that we'll have to tune in tomorrow for. Okay, coming up, what's next in U.S.-Canada trade talks? Well, how could that also be affected by China's new deal with the United States on tariffs. Will Canada see a reprieve as well? The front bench will talk about that after a quick break.
There were some difficult times. I think that Justin Trudeau and the president didn't exactly get along, and Canada kept making it worse and worse with their rhetoric. But now I think that we've had, the prime minister come in and meet with the president and begin a new, closer relationship. And so I'm sure everything will work out fine with Canada in the end.
That was U.S. National Economic Council Director Kevin Haslett earlier today on the state of relations between Canada and the U.S. Comes just as the Trump White House marked a major trade truce, dramatically slashing tariffs on China, and China responding by doing the same. So what does all of this mean for Canada as we continue to fight our trade war and have any kind of negotiation? Well, let's bring back the front bench. Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. Dan, I'll start with you on this one. Earlier in the show, we talked about this with Kirsten Hillman, the Canadian ambassador to the U.S. She thinks Canada's deal will be very much bespoke, but how much do you think that this truce with China gives Canadians hope and trade negotiators a bit of a roadmap here?
Well, I think if we look at the deals that have recently been announced, both with China and the United Kingdom, there's not really as much substance there as I think Canada is hopeful for in an eventual deal with the United States. The reality with all things out of this White House is that it seems to be a lot more noise than it is actual content. Yes, China has had a delay on tariffs for 90 days, but their tariffs were also egregiously high, right? And there was a situation in which America really, I don't think, could tolerate that kind of tariff on its economy for much longer anyways. And so a lot of this feels like performative action. The deal with the UK feels very performative, not a lot of substance there. I think Canada and America both want a deal that is substantive, that is long-term, that actually preserves the key elements of the current free trade arrangement for the long term, right? And I think the ambassador earlier spoke about a bespoke deal that serves our interests and their interests. The reality is both economies count on each other for a lot of things and count on each other for a lot of benefits to everyday workers and everyday consumers. And so I think the reality of that has always been a hope for Canada that we could get to a deal because America also needs things from us. Last week at the White House, I think Carney and Prime Minister Carney and President Trump started to move us in that direction. And I certainly, by all accounts, there is an opportunity for Canada to realize a deal. I think the hope is that it's a lot more substantive than what we're seeing in the current deal making out of the White House.
How important is that, Kathleen, to try and push the ball forward, saying, as Dan just said, more substantive than what we're seeing from the other two?
I mean, I agree with Dan completely that the deals that are coming out of the UK and China aren't substantive, but come on, I mean, still, you hear the announcement today that for 90 days, 115% tariffs are dropped. I mean, but that just shows how ridiculous the tariffs were in the first place. I mean, this tariff escalation has caused so much chaos, so much destruction, and wealth destruction, frankly, retirement count destruction over the last, 3 months that it's been in terms of the escalation that Trump and the war that he has waged globally, really. In terms of Canada, though, what I take away more so is Mr. LeBlanc's comments on the political shows this weekend on Question Period with Vashi Kapelos and others, that he really thinks he's not going to push towards a quick renegotiation of CUSMA, but actually wants to see the tariff issue dealt with quickly. I mean, the meeting, by all accounts, was successful last week. Even if graded on a curve, it was very successful. And I think that really right now, we need to work at kind of making life a bit better right now, so our forestry workers, our metal workers, are not, dealing with this and facing the layoffs. Our auto workers are facing the layoffs that they have been.
Yeah, and Shakir, it comes as Reuters reporting that the economy minister in Mexico is saying that CUSMA, the CUSMA renegotiation review, may actually start as soon as at the later part of this year. So what do you think of what Kathleen is saying, though, that, it is kind of like a two-lane highway here that we have to get to with the tariffs before the CUSMA?
I think whatever the process is on our side, we just need to establish that with the United States and ensure we can drive that process forward to remove tariffs. I think when I look at what's happening with Trump, with China, and then Trump with the UK, I do think he's looking for an off-ramp. I think he realizes that tariffs are probably not the right tool. And you have economists and experts come out and say all these negative things are going to happen. I think for Donald Trump, he doesn't move until reality just like slaps him in the face, right? And so when you start seeing inflation, you start seeing lack of supply on the shelves, you start seeing a lot of economic damage. I think that's when he starts to react. For all the names we can call Donald Trump, people think he's not the brightest guy. I think when you get him behind closed doors and in a private room and he sees the damage that he's causing, he realizes that he's gone wrong in a policy direction and he looks for a way to get out of that policy. And I think it's going to be the same way with Canada. I don't know the timeline, but whether it is a track for tariffs specifically, whether it is Kuzma, given how intertwined our economies are, at some point when he starts seeing that economic damage, he'll look for an off-ramp with us as well. And I think, give credit to Mark Carney, it was a good first meeting. There'll be a way for us to kind of negotiate away from tariffs and kind of get this relationship back on track.
Yeah, and Laura, it seems like that off-ramp is a bit more of a sort of easy curve off rather than a hard right at this point.
Well, look, I mean, President Trump reminds me a bit of my 3-year-old. He likes to break his toys and then get credit for putting them back together, even though he's the one who created the problem in the first place, right? Like, he's caused this mass chaos globally, and now he's reversing it, and he wants a pat on the back, and that seems to be the play. I'm not deep psychologically into what he's thinking, but I do think clearly the relationship with Canada has been reset. We saw that last week with Prime Minister Carney. There was something about Mr. Trudeau that rubbed Mr. Trump the wrong way on a very deep personal level. He referenced comments that allegedly former Prime Minister Trudeau told him that Canada essentially wouldn't have an economy without the United States or something. He seems to have run with that. We still have to resolve, of course, the sovereignty issue and the 51st state issue. And Mr. Carney tried to put that to bed last week. And I think it's still unresolved, to put it lightly, for most Canadians. But obviously, President Trump has much more respect for our Prime Minister currently, and he wants to reset that relationship, whether that's because financially, globally, the markets are crashing, whether that's because he's getting pushback domestically from his own people for the tariff chaos that he's causing. I think the signs are positive for Canada, and the Canadians and Americans are probably looking for a marker here, with which to come up with some new agreement, whether that is potentially this summer with the G7 meetings in Canada, that could potentially be a way for both countries to come to some sort of agreement or announcement or progress made on the tariff front, and to make some sort of joint announcement if Mr. Trump is genuine in his intentions of resetting this relationship with Canada now.
Okay, I got to wrap it up. Before I do, I want to make sure that our control room cuts that section of the video where Laura compared her 3-year-old to Donald Trump to show her 3-year-old in 10 years when he's 13. He'll be so proud of that, Laura. Really appreciate it. Okay, time for us to go. Appreciate you all on the front bench. We're going to be right back after this with our goodbyes.